thank you, Amy, and also thank you to Rabbi David Kessel, to Mark Young, and Carrie Darsky from JCCA, who I've been working with in the lead up to joining you today, and for Barak and for Deanne Foreman, who have already been incredible thought partners in thinking about how some of these trends affect all of you in the JCC movement. And thank you to the Mifgash Planning Committee for all your hard work and for making the choice to put data on the main stage. So your conference is about this moment and seizing this moment. And so I want to start by naming this moment that we are in. And this moment feels hard and tense right now. It's not because of any single factor, but because multiple forces are converging all at once. Still, the long tail of COVID has made it so nothing has exactly returned to normal. The impact of October 7th on the Jewish people still sits with us every day, even though the last hostage is home. And I think we can breathe a sigh of relief that we are on the other side of this war. Anti-Semitism is up and on the rise, and there is growing tension and polarization in our broader American society. These forces interact with each other, and they're shaping how Jews are showing up in community. They're shaping what they're seeking and what they need from the institutions that serve them. My goal today is to surface the data and trends and what they are revealing about Jewish life in this moment, and then to focus on what those trends may be asking of Jewish leadership, particularly institutions that sit at the center of people's lived Jewish experience. One of the reasons this conversation matters so much is because of where JCCs already sit in the broader Jewish ecosystem as the place in the center. For the 141 Jewish federations that I work with every day, JCCs are consistently one of the top 3 investments or allocations of that federation, and that is intentional and a choice and a belief in the JCCs. And that is true really regardless of the model of the JCCs or the community. That represents roughly 20% of all allocations of our federations system-wide. That represents a deep partnership and a shared understanding of the central role JCCs play in building flourishing Jewish communities, especially in moments of change and uncertainty. Before we dive into the data, I want to say something about what the data represents. The findings that I'll share today are mostly based on surveys that JFNA has conducted, although I'll look at ones of partners across the sector, and it's mostly of US Jews. We do not have as good data on Canadian Jewry, but we are working very closely with our Canadian Jewish Federation partners and with academics in Canada to make sure we get that. I also want to name that we are going to look at national trends, and every community is different. We work very closely with individual communities to understand those differences and help communities think about what that means for how you act. And yet at the same time, I want to name that every time we do a study in a community or show up in a community, we see that these national trends consistently are there, even if they're in slightly different ways, depending on whether you're a larger community or a smaller community, whether you're urban or more rural, whether you lean politically more left or more right, younger or older. The differences happen in expected ways, but the trends are fairly consistent. With that framing, let's talk a little bit more about what is happening. So I talked about the challenges that we're facing as a society today, and what we're seeing is that is presenting a series of opportunities for how we can bring the community together. We are seeing that Jewish life is changing quickly and simultaneously, that people are actually re-entering or entering community for the first time, as we will discuss in more depth, that many are experiencing a deeper, more emotional connection to Israel, that there's a heightened need for physical and emotional and communal safety, and that there's a real desire to remain in community across differences, even as those differences are hard and fraught. So now we'll go deeper into each of these challenges, and then after that, I'm really glad that we'll hear from JCC leaders, from CEOs of communities sharing their experiences, and that you'll have a chance to talk more with each other. And I'll give a brief promo for those who are particularly interested. We will have a workshop after specifically on the surge or the rise in engagement and how different JCCs can and are responding. So let's talk about Israel. October 7th heightened Jewish identity and emotional attachment to Israel versus what we saw in Pew 2020. 71% of Jews, by the way, it says today, this is from a study, most of this data is from a study conducted almost a year ago in March 2025, and we will be doing that study again in 2026. But what we saw in March 2025 at the height of the war is that emotional connection to Israel was way up. It was slightly down from the months right after October 7th when they were really at their height, but both times up from Pew 2020. People feel deeply connected to Israel, and that has led them to care more for Israel and Israelis, to want to learn about Israel from all different sources, and to want to give to Israel philanthropically. What we heard in our studies and in our interviews with people is they feel much more comfortable speaking about this connection to Israel and their feelings about Israel with other Jews versus non-Jews, whether that is at work, in their neighborhood, or in peer groups. And so the Israel conversation is actually pulling people towards Jewish spaces because there's trust in the fact that we share a relationship and care, even when they know we do not always share political perspectives. So here's a quote from one of our interviews. Someone said, "It's rare that my identity as a Jew is activated and feels like the most important element of my personality or my identity. The only time I've experienced that was immediately after October 7th, because it suddenly got a lot more salient. It was like my Jewishness is the way into the biggest story in the world right now. And that matters, and that's why people are showing up more and connecting more." So I need to tie that directly to this next slide about polarization. Polarization is happening today globally across many issues. This is not unique to Israel or the Jewish community. And it is fueled by politicians, and it is fueled by our social media feeds. While the widening of these extremes are leading to a shrinking middle ground, you should know that the middle is still the very largest group, right? So there are more people, and certainly louder people, on the polls of opinion on any issue, but most people would identify themselves somewhere in the middle. The way that looks in data is that more people say that they are moderate or liberal politically than progressive or very progressive, conservative or very conservative, right? So most people are in the middle, but the polls have a greater sense of comfort speaking their minds than people in the middle. And that affects everyone's sense of comfort and belonging and where the community might stand. I will also share something that you may be feeling in your own communities, which is one of the issues where there's a lot of disagreement, is not only about Israel itself, but about where the institutional Jewish community stands in supporting Israel. So when we ask people if they want the Jewish community to speak out on Israel, they say absolutely yes. And here's the challenge that you're likely feeling. 39% of Jews feel like the American Jewish community is too hardline in support of Israel. That's a big number. And yet, 34% of Jews feel like the American Jewish community is not strong and outspoken enough in its support of Israel. That means that the smallest group here is actually in the middle, thinking we're getting it exactly right, and it's what is making it so hard to figure out how to nail that statement that you want to make about Israel. But at the same time, remember, people are generally connected and care deeply. And something else that I feel like is important on this is this 71% of Jews who are open to being in community with Jews who disagree with their views on Israel. By the way, we see that as the surge that we're about to talk about in engagement is still happening among people who think their views might be more left or right on Israel than the mainstream of the Jewish community, which is many, which means that they're still showing up in our communities, and that is why it feels so fraught. And it's good that people are standing together and willing to be connected across difference. So one of the things we see about how this impacts engagement, when we interview people, they say, I want you to help me find like-minded Jewish communities. They want to find people who agree with them, especially those who haven't been engaged before. They want our help finding people, families who think like them, who they can feel the most comfortable around. That is a really helpful path in, and it may be who you want to sit around a Shabbat table with, and yet it is also our role as Jewish leaders to make sure that while people are finding their path in with people they agree with, they are also finding ways to sit in community with those who they may disagree with. Next trend. Jews are concerned right now about anti-Semitism in the non-Jewish community. And that is because they are personally experiencing anti-Semitism. It is not an unfounded fear. 52% say they have personally experienced some form of anti-Semitism in the past year. 86 have witnessed it in person or online. A lot of that is online. And 70% say they still feel physically safe in Jewish spaces. So what does this mean? People are experiencing anti-Semitism and they are deeply concerned about it. And you should know it is changing their behavior. They are making plans for worst-case scenarios. They are changing the places they frequent, and in some cases, they are changing whether they, put a baseball cap over their kippah, whether they feel comfortable wearing their Magen David publicly, although actually both those trends are happening. We have people who tell us, I took my Magen David off. I didn't want people to ask about my Jewish star, and others who say, right now especially, it's important that I put on a Jewish star. So we see both, but we also see that people are leaning into community despite that fear, and they tend to feel safe in Jewish spaces. The more they know, the more safe they feel, and there are two things especially that Jewish institutions and the JCC in particular can do here. One is that when people see physical security, they feel safer. And when they know what you're doing to keep them safe, they feel safer. And those are different things. What you're doing and what people know about it are not the same thing. And so communication may be as important as action. And the other thing is the number one thing people tell us they want in terms of feeling safer around anti-Semitism is for Jews to be in relationship with non-Jews. And JCCs have a special role to play here, because most JCCs have a significant number of non-Jewish members, and that role is critical. Okay. So one of the things, let me connect the dots here, that we know about people who experience anti-Semitism, and we know it from ADL's research, not our own, is that the top post-traumatic response to anti-Semitism is showing up more in Jewish community. How beautiful, right? You might think it would make you walk away because that might feel unsafe, but instead the number one post-traumatic response is leaning in. And that is a phenomenon that JFNA, that my team started studying last year in 2024, and the reason is that we heard from people that after October 7th, when they were running, and this is from communal leaders, when they were running vigils and programs and learning seminars, a ton of people across the community, Jewish and non-Jewish, showed up. And then they would tell us I didn't have to put those chairs away because more people kept coming to the things I do every day. And we were fascinated. So in our March 2024 study, we measured this phenomenon of increase in interest in engagement and engagement in different ways in Jewish life. And when we wrote about it in 2024, we coined the term the surge, which has now become pretty common in discussions about this phenomenon of people leaning into Jewish communities since October 7th. So let me talk about what's happening there. At that time, 43% of the community was surging, and still in 2025, 31% of the community was surging. And we are going to look a little bit more at what it means, but I want to name that the surge is all about action, but you may not see all of it in our institutions, because that action includes increasing interpersonal relationships with other Jews, informal gatherings, learning online, learning in person, and participating in one-off Jewish communal programs and being more part of Jewish institutions. It includes advocacy and leadership in all different ways, including what might be happening in the city council or the public school, right? And so there's lots of ways. We try to only track action. We actually have people who haven't acted at all and feel something different, and they're not counted in this number. So 31% is leaning in some way more in this moment. And the 31% tells us that in 2025 it was still higher. We will know soon whether that has sustained, but we suspect so, and that we may actually land at a new normal rate. Whether that sustains in many ways is up to all of us. Interestingly, on this slide, and we're going to talk about this in more depth, there are two groups where that surge sustained the most, or was the stickiest. One is for people who were already very engaged pre-October 7th, and the other is for those who were not at all engaged, so who self-identified as doing nothing in the Jewish community before October 7th, did more after October 7th, and there has been a stickiness to that new engagement. So let's talk in particular, and I believe this is Barak's favorite stat from the surge research, about what's happening among those who were not at all engaged before. These are the people on the periphery of Jewish life, and as someone who entered the Jewish community through Hillel and as a Jewish Campus Service Corps fellow, those people who are on the periphery have been a focus for a long time, and they are very, very difficult to move. If you do nothing and you're not seeking anything, there's not a lot that all of us who are adept at community engagement and outreach can do to get people in the door, but this moment didn't. They started showing up, and many of them have stayed. So what are they doing? First, I'm going to name the number one thing they're doing is actually online. It's social media, it's WhatsApp groups. They found the other Jews in their neighborhood, and they started, a text thread with those individuals so they could know who was in their neighborhood. They joined a Facebook group of moms talking about anti-Semitism on college campuses, right? Those kind of things are the number one that people did. They a lot of times are learning and listening to podcasts and Jewish news sites. And there is a question for all of us, for the people who are doing that, how do we connect to them and support them where they are, or make sure they know that they're welcome in our institutions? And I'll also name the other thing before we get to this incredible stat about JCCs, which is they're spending a lot more time with Jewish friends, and the stories they tell us here are both they're making new Jewish friends, they're looking for other Jews, and sometimes they already knew these folks, but they never talked to them about anything Jewish before. It didn't feel particularly important or salient, and all of a sudden they're having Jewish conversations that, again, are something for us all to think about. Given the educators in our midst, how do we support that independent activity that's happening? So here's what we know about JCCs, which is JCCs are the leading institutional destination for this group that did nothing before. And when we conduct qualitative interviews, we believe that this is due to the low religious bar, right? They don't feel like they have to know anything. They don't have to stand up and sit down at the right moments or identify with a particular movement to show up in your institutions. They also name that they feel JCCs are welcoming of interfaith and multi-faith families, a group that often doesn't feel a sense of belonging, but feels they can show up or join the JCC, and it matters that they can show up with their non-Jewish peers. So those are some of what we heard in the qualitative interviews about why JCCs show up as this leading destination, and that matters and puts you really in a leadership role for how we, across the Jewish community, welcome this group of Jews on the periphery. Okay. So when we look at segments of Jewish life that are showing up more, I want to talk about the number one segment, or one of the top segments, which is midlife adults, in particular that 29% with no kids at home. So this is empty nesters. They are one of the largest shares of the surge. This is breaking down the surge in a pie chart by age, and they're one of the largest segments of our Jewish community. And because their kids are no longer at home, they have more time, more capacity, and more desire for connection. Oftentimes they tell us they were involved in the Jewish community before. They knew how to access the Jewish community when it was about programs for their kids, but they didn't think they needed it as their kids got older and finished Hebrew school and bar mitzvah, and they don't really know what's there for them right now or how to access it. And this group feels a lot of fear right now. They describe anti-Semitism with very particular language around a resurgence of an older moment in anti-Semitism that they're afraid of, and they are seeking other connections, people of their age and stage and places that can facilitate that. So I'll read a quote from one of our interviews. This person said, "Being retired, unfortunately, I do spend much of my time online. A while back after the attack, it's like, let's see how other Jewish people are reacting to this. I'd seen through other various postings, and I'd respond to people. And that's how I've been able to meet and converse with quite a few people who now have become actual friends." So what's really interesting about this group is they are the ones most likely to be online building connections. People always think it's the young adults. The young adults, especially because they went through that COVID moment where they couldn't connect, tell us they'd rather show up in person. But a lot of these folks in midlife are online finding community and would like to show up in person, but don't necessarily know where to find their place right now. And there's a huge opportunity here for the Jewish community to do the kind of engagement that a few years ago we weren't as good at for young adults between college and kids, and we've gotten a lot more programming in that space, and today that space for innovation is in midlife. Okay, next topic is belonging. So of all these people who are showing up more, we know that many of them are from diverse demographics who may not consider themselves in the mainstream of the Jewish community by identity. And we know that because the Jewish community itself is getting more diverse, right? We have more interfaith and multi-faith families. We have more racial diversity. We have more people who are LGBTQ plus identified, disability identified. We've seen denominational shifts, many who don't consider themselves a part of any denomination today. And a lot of these impact people's sense of belonging. What we saw with the surge is that historically marginalized groups surged at higher rates initially in 2024. Those people who had once felt on the outskirts of Jewish community, this moment called them to look for connection and to seek a sense of belonging. And unfortunately, the surge has been sustained at a lower rate. It is still there. There's still a significant desire for connection. I didn't put all the groups that we surveyed up here. It's too much data. But for example, whereas the overall drop was 12%, among those who self-identify with questions we asked around financial vulnerability, the surge dropped 17%. Among LGBTQ plus individuals and their household, the surge dropped 28%. And among mixed heritage or multi-faith or interfaith households, the surge actually has always been much lower, many times because these folks don't know if they will be welcome or connect, or they may have lower interest to begin with, and so it's at that much lower 22%. So what does this mean? So from your own benchmarking data, we actually know that JCCs, 91% of people in your benchmarking survey, which surveyed 30,000 plus JCC and JCC camp users of all background, 91% say that JCCs strengthen overall community well-being. We know that JCCs have a potential and are a place that can welcome people of all these backgrounds, which means that you have an opportunity to lead our community with individuals who might otherwise not feel a sense of belonging because even as the surge has crashed for these individuals more than others, it is still there, and they are still seeking engagement today. So belonging is increasingly a design and leadership questions. When we ask further qualitative questions about what people need to see right now, it sounds exactly like what we heard in studies before October 7th, meaning there's nothing special that we need to do right now, but a lot of times when people say they showed up and didn't feel welcome or had a more negative experience, it's the same things as before. They need proactive outreach. They need to know and see that there will be people like them, and they need to know before they're willing to show up that there will be supports and welcoming and accessibility when they're there, including financial accessibility, including the ability to get transportation there. They need to know that we're going to go out of our way to make them feel like they belong. The last group that I'm going to talk about is that very high surge and sticky surge among the already very engaged. And I want to name what that group is because they are already our members, our board members. They're the people who are sitting around telling us what they need. And sometimes that can feel demanding, that cry for connection. Sometimes it can feel difficult, like someone's giving you an order. We need to do more. We need to say more. We're not doing enough. That's often what we're hearing from the individuals in this very engaged group, because what we know is that group is most likely to be connected to the events in Israel. They are most likely to know about incidents of anti-Semitism. They are most likely to feel comfortable demanding of our institutions, and this is a huge opportunity because they are seeking emotional care, depth, voice, and meaningful responsibility, and we can give them roles. We can give them leadership. We can encourage their philanthropy and their advocacy and their time, and people who are asked to give are much more likely to feel their own sense of ownership, which not only will grant their need for us doing more, but will give them a leadership role in a time when we need this kind of Jewish communal leadership and these pathways to contributions. Okay, so we're talking about this moment and what the data says about this moment, and we're in a slightly different moment than when this data was collected in March 2025. I cannot wait to survey and then share with you what we see in March 2026, but we know we're in a different moment with the last hostage finally home, and we know that these factors continue to create pressures on our community, but JCCs can play a particular role in the trends we're seeing, in creating entry points for the newly engaged, in creating platforms and leadership opportunities for the deeply engaged, in creating anchors for safety and belonging and connection with our non-Jewish community. And so how we lean into this time and create a new normal for this community can truly shape Jewish life for years to come.